At 8:30 p.m., Albany Police Detective P.J. McKenna rolls to 799 Myrtle Avenue. An 85-year-old woman has been found wandering the neighborhood.
We were informed that she was in the early stages, at the very least, of dementia, and really couldn't provide much, only to say that he had hurt her.
Inside the old woman's house, McKenna finds blood and evidence of a possible rape.
Nothing was taken, but the phone cords were pulled out. It was the phone cord that was actually tied up in a knot, as if used for holding something, tying someone up.
With no identified suspects, the case is not a priority for DNA testing. Eventually, a DNA profile is extracted from semen found on the victim's body and entered into the state's data bank as an unsolved case.
With no one in the neighborhood being able to know anything, nothing off canvas, nothing off registered or known sex offenders, it went cold. We had no leads in this case.
Less than 2 months later, detectives McKenna and Tim Carroll arrive at the apartment of Martha Montalvo, a 50-year-old woman with a history of mental illness. Inside, they find a dead body and a crime scene already several days gone cold.
There was no forced entry, there was no struggle by the doors. She was decomposed, advanced stages of decomposition. Her buttocks was propped up on some pillows. She was partially naked. There was a towel draped on her face, and she was blood-soaked.
And we had both said, after speaking to dozens of people in the area and seeing the scene, that this was going to be a forensic case. It was going to be something where we were going to need a forensic break.
An autopsy reveals no evidence of semen in the body. The victim's blood-stained jeans and bedding are sent out for DNA testing. Detectives get a hit, not to an individual, but to the unsolved rape of an 85-year-old woman committed just 6 weeks before the Montalvo homicide and only 5 blocks away.
In the first case, it was someone who was clearly stalking an individual for the purpose of sex. And 6 weeks later, he sees some more prey, follows her into her house, attempts to take sex, and when she defends herself, he is not afraid to turn in a moment and turn it into a homicide and kill her to put her down.
Detective McKenna believes he is looking for a sexual predator, one who targets older or vulnerable women. Detective McKenna, however, is wrong.
It was so violent. Right here, when they came through the door, he had to stand up to open the door, and he was laying here almost like in a fetal position.
Just after 12 noon, P.J. McKenna and Detective Jack Grogan respond to the home of 69-year-old George Young. Inside, they find Mr. Young beaten, bloody, and dead.
And the pool of blood that Mr. Young was laying in, you could see that it was an extremely violent crime that happened here.
Detectives find an unlocked safe near the body, indicating robbery to be the likely motive. Also near the body, a bloody piece of steel, otherwise known as rebar.
Just looking at the position of George Young and the way his head looked, to me, that looked pretty obvious that was probably the murder weapon.
So many little things.
An autopsy determines that George Young was both beaten and shot. While detectives don't recover a gun, this news bolsters their theory that this was a two-man operation.
When one of them brought the safe down, they stopped right about here, and they put the safe on the floor. While this was going on, the other one was beating George still.
He beat him numerous times in his head, about the body. From the injuries that we could see from the autopsy photos, it was numerous to count.
Detectives hit the street, hoping to find out who knew what about George Young's money.
Everyone in that part of town, which is economically depressed, said that George had money.
He wouldn't let people in his house unless he knew who they were. I mean, that's one of the things that piqued our interest when we found Mr. Young. How did somebody get into his house? Not by not forcing the door. He had to let him in So we had to know who they were.
Detectives learn of a handyman who did odd jobs for the victim. Someone George Young would have allowed into his home. Someone already familiar to police.
This was someone who had a checkered history. His name had come up in a previous investigation, a previous homicide investigation. His name was on a short list of possibilities amongst street people.
The handyman is brought in for questioning and denies killing Young.
We also asked him to take a polygraph, which he initially agreed to, and then, as hard as it is to imagine for a person who was in his 40s, refused to cooperate any further unless his mother could be in the interview room with him at all times. He didn't want a lawyer, he wanted his mom.
The handyman ultimately refuses to take a polygraph. Meanwhile, evidence from the crime scene is examined for possible clues. Of particular interest, the probable murder weapon.
Ultimately, the decision was made by our forensics unit to send it out for identification in the hopes that whoever had taken this, I mean, when you use this with such force, if you're not wearing gloves, you can cut your hand on the metal, or as it twists in your hand, you can leave skin scrapings behind.
The actual piece of rebar in the case was longer. And it
On
had
February
a
11th, criminalist Nicole Zavotek examines the piece of rebar used to kill George Young.
appeared that the way
She focuses on the end with very little blood, believing it to be the end most likely handled by the killer.
I took another swab towards the very end, and that's the swab, DNA-wise, that ended up yielding a mixture profile.
It's a mixture of blood from the victim and a little something from the killer.
Most likely it's skin cells, shed skin cells, or from sweat.
The partial profile is plugged into CODIS. It doesn't match to any offenders in the system or to a voluntary DNA sample taken from George Young's handyman. But investigators do get a match, one that takes them by surprise.
And we got a case-to-case hit on this case with 2 other previous cases.
A hit to 2 crimes that have already been linked. The sexual assault of an 85-year-old Albany woman and the murder of 50-year-old Martha Montalva.
It was an unbelievable revelation when it came back from the lab. Scary. These people just, they had no connection to each other. They had none.
DNA has connected the dots for detectives. 3 crimes, 1 person. Now the hunt is on to find out who.
It was someone who was very much alive, someone who was still very much active, unfortunately, and had expanded not only their area, but their MO.
Forensics has matched the unknown profile to a convicted felon named Ramon McGill.
We had no idea who he was. He was no one that was on our radar. His name had never come up, never come up in any crimes.
McGill is sitting in a New York State prison on an unrelated robbery conviction from earlier in the year.
Going through his criminal history, very petty stuff. I mean, some drug arrests and that attempted robbery, but other than that, nothing major.
Like you said, talking to the...
Nothing major, and no substantial ties to any of the victims. A DNA match, however, would seem to be enough for a conviction. Detectives sit McGill down and get down to business, beginning with the most recent murder.
We just started with, did you ever know George Young? And first he denied it.
Asked him if he'd ever been in this house, old George's house, and he said no. And again, that was when...
Detectives know they've caught McGill in a lie and begin to unpack their evidence for the suspect.
Well, let me show you some paperwork. This is your DNA, and this says that the odds of another person having the same DNA are 1 in something like 26 billion. So do you want to tell me how it is that your DNA is in this house? You want to tell me the truth now?
His shoulders just seemed to, they went down like, now it's time. It's time to tell us what actually happened.
Ramon McGill confesses to beating George Young to death, but he says he didn't do it alone. He names another person as the one who shot Young. The same handyman who refused to take a police polygraph at the time of the murder.
Once old George opens the door, Ramon starts to hit him.
They demanded where the safe was because they knew there was a safe in the house. When the safe was brought down, he asked him the combination. The combination was wrong, and he started striking again and again. And with George's dying breath, he gave the correct numbers to the combination to stop the beating.
McGill says his accomplice then shot George Young in the head, and they took off with about $1,200 in cash. Detectives next press McGill about Martha Montalvo.
He was confronted again with the DNA, and he was told, "You told us what you did on Alexander Street. You told us that the DNA down there was yours. So how do you explain your DNA?" And there was this pause, and he looks out the window, he looks back, and he said, "Okay, that was me, I was there, I killed him."
Justice is not served here today because the killer, madman, still runs free, and I'm being punished for it.
The killer McGill refers to, the accomplice he says shot George Young, a handyman police had looked at in 2004 and continue looking at today.
The challenge now is to develop sufficient evidence, apart from what McGill has told us, to prosecute this other person. Because under New York law, we cannot use a co-defendant statement as a basis for a prosecution. We need some evidence, whether it's testimonial or whether it's physical evidence, linking this other person to the commission of the crime. And the police are working on that now.
As for Raymond McGill, he will serve 40 years to life for his crimes.